Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're taking a look at multimodal large language models.
The AI that can deal with both text and images.
Right. Pretty amazing stuff.
It is.
And so we've got a research paper here that takes a look at a problem that's kind of emerging in the field.
Yeah.
And that is the problem of redundancy and how we're testing these MLLMs.
Yeah, it's almost like you've got, a toolkit
Mm-hmm.
with a bunch of screwdrivers that all do the same thing. You don't really need them all.
Right.
And we're kind of seeing the same thing with these benchmarks.
Okay. So we've got all these tests popping up, but they might be stepping on each other's toes a little bit.
That's right, yeah. This paper breaks it down into three main types of redundancy.
Good.
The
Yeah.
first one is redundancy across dimensions within a single benchmark. So, imagine you've got a test with, separate sections for reading comprehension and vocabulary.
Hmm.
If those sections end up measuring very similar skills, then that's a sign of dimensional redundancy.
Okay. So it's not really giving us a full picture of the model's capabilities.
Exactly.
What about the second type?
The second type is redundancy among instances within a benchmark. So this is kind of like asking the same question multiple times
Right.
with like slight tweaks, but it doesn't add much value.
Got it. So lots of questions, but not a lot of new information.
Right.
And the third type?
The third type is redundancy across benchmarks. So we might have separate tests claiming to measure different aspects of, say, visual reasoning or problem solving.
Mm-hmm.
But if those tests are actually tapping into the same underlying capabilities,
Yeah.
then we've got redundancy across benchmarks.
I see. So how did these researchers actually go about trying to measure this redundancy?
Well, they used something called the performance correlation redundancy framework. And the basic idea is to look at how different MLLMs rank on different tests or different sections of a test. And if the rankings are very similar, then there's a good chance that those tests are redundant.
So if Model A consistently beats Model B on a bunch of seemingly different tests,
Right.
those tests might actually be measuring very similar things.
Exactly.
Okay. And to get even more specific, I see that they used a bunch of different statistical tools like the Spearman Rank Correlation Coefficient, the SRCC, the Pearson Linear Correlation Coefficient, PLCC,
Yeah.
and the R-squared score.
Yep.
I'm guessing those are all different ways of measuring how similar two sets of rankings are.
Yeah. So the SRCC just focuses on how the models are ranked, regardless of their exact scores. PLCC takes the actual values of those scores into account.
Okay.
And R squared tells us how much of the variation in one set of rankings can be explained by the other.
So it's a little bit more nuanced than just saying, hey, these tests look kind of similar.
Right, exactly.
So one of the case studies that they looked at was MMBench, which is a pretty popular benchmark for evaluating MLLMs.
Right.
What did they find when they took a close look at MMBench?
Well, they noticed this fascinating difference between the top performing models and the bottom performing models.
Okay.
The lower performing models actually showed much higher redundancy. As they got better at one task, their performance seemed to improve across the board.
Interesting. So does that suggest that the less advanced models are kind of learning more general skills?
It could be, yeah. That's one of the questions that that the researchers are kind of exploring. Maybe these models are still developing, like a kind of foundational intelligence that applies broadly. But when they looked at the top performers, they saw a very different pattern. The very best models, they showed more specialized abilities, excelling in some areas, but then being kind of weaker in others.
So like the top models are less like all-rounders
Yeah.
and more like specialists.
Yeah, exactly. And this distinction actually led to lower redundancy scores for the top performing models.
This reminds me of the idea that as we learn more, we become more aware of what we don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe it's a similar thing for these MLLMs.
That's a good point. It makes you wonder if this pattern kind of holds true across other benchmarks as well.
Well, it sounds like they went beyond just MMBench in this research.
They did.
What did they find when they looked at the bigger picture?
Well, they analyzed 18 different benchmarks. Not just for visual reasoning, but for all sorts of capabilities. And here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
The data suggests that many of these benchmarks could be cut in half
What?
without significantly affecting the overall ranking of the models.
Wow, that's huge. I mean, we're talking about saving a lot of time and resources
Exactly.
if we can identify and eliminate redundant tests.
Yeah. This has big implications for how efficiently we can develop MLLMs, you know?
Hmm.
Think about all the researchers and engineers who could be focusing their efforts on, more targeted and meaningful evaluations.
This is really starting to feel like more than just an academic exercise.
Yeah.
This has real-world consequences for how we build and understand these really powerful AI systems.
Absolutely. And this is just the beginning. There's a whole other section in this paper that looks at redundancy specifically within math-focused benchmarks. And that's where things get even more nuanced.
Okay, now you've got me really curious.
Yeah.
Let's dive into those findings next.
Yeah.
But before we do, I think it's important to kind of step back for a second
Mm-hmm.
and think about why you, the listener, should care about this issue of redundancy in these benchmarks.
Yeah.
It's not just about saving researchers time and effort, although that's important,
Right.
but it's also about understanding, the claims that are made about these AI capabilities.
Mhm.
When you see a headline about some new model that's, amazing at math or whatever,
Yeah.
it's important to remember that, to ask how was that ability actually measured
Yeah.
and how much redundancy might be baked into those measurements.
It's a good point. We need to be a little bit more critical consumers of, of the AI hype and really kind of dig deeper into how these systems are actually being evaluated.
Because the more we understand about the benchmarks, the better we can understand what these models are truly capable of
Right.
and where their limitations are.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's get into these math benchmarks.
Yeah.
What do they find about redundancy there?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting. Even within something like math, which seems pretty straightforward,
Yeah.
there's a lot of variation in how different benchmarks actually assess those skills.
You mean like some math tests are more mathy than others?
Kind of, yeah. Some benchmarks were, very focused. They were really trying to test specific math concepts or problem-solving strategies.
Okay.
But then others were a lot broader. They might include, elements of logical reasoning, visual pattern recognition,
Right.
even like a bit of language understanding.
Wait, how can a math test involve language understanding?
Well, think about like a word problem, right?
Yeah.
You don't just have to do the calculations. You have to interpret the context and figure out which information is actually relevant.
Right, right.
So those kinds of tasks show up in some benchmarks,
Hmm.
and it adds like a whole other layer of complexity.
I see. So even within math, there are kind of different levels of redundancy,
Yeah.
depending on how narrowly or broadly a benchmark defines the skill that it's actually trying to test.
Exactly. And, that distinction is really important.
Okay.
Because, if you're developing an MLLM that you want to use for like financial modeling, you'd probably want to pick a benchmark that's really focused on those specific math skills.
Right.
But if you're trying to build a more general purpose model
Yeah.
that can handle a lot of different kinds of tasks, then a benchmark with a bit more redundancy built in might actually be a bold choice.
So it's about being intentional about, matching the benchmark to how you're actually going to use the MLLM.
That's a great way to put it, yeah. It's all about intentionality. And, this paper doesn't just talk about the problem of redundancy. It actually offers some really practical advice for how to address it.
Okay, well, let's hear it.
All right. So they recommend this 3-step approach.
Okay.
The first step is to do something called a dimension redundancy check during benchmark development.
Okay.
And basically what that means is you're analyzing the different sections or dimensions of your test to see how much overlap there is.
So it's like a quality control check.
Yeah, exactly. You want to make sure that each part of the test is actually providing unique information.
Okay, makes sense. And then what's step 2?
Step 2 is the instance redundancy check.
Okay.
And this is all about figuring out if you could get the same results with, a smaller set of questions or tasks.
So like if you've got a test with 100 math problems,
Right.
maybe you could actually get away with just using 50.
Exactly.
Right.
Without sacrificing too much in terms of the accuracy of your evaluation.
Okay, so we've got dimension redundancy, instance redundancy. What's the third type?
The third step is the cross-benchmark redundancy check.
I'm guessing that's where you kind of zoom out and look for redundancy across different benchmarks.
Yeah, so this is where you're comparing benchmarks side by side, seeing how much they overlap in terms of the skills they're evaluating.
Okay.
And this helps researchers to, to choose the benchmarks that are going to be most efficient and most representative.
So if I'm, a researcher and I'm trying to benchmark, let's say, how well an MLLM can generate realistic dialogue,
Right.
this step would help me figure out which benchmark is going to be, the most comprehensive, the most relevant to my research question.
Exactly. So by taking this three-step approach,
Yeah.
we can move towards, a system of evaluation that's more efficient, more focused, and ultimately more meaningful.
It seems like it all comes back to this idea of being more intentional
Yeah.
about how we build and assess these AI systems.
Yeah. I think that's a really, really important point. And, that intentionality can actually lead to some pretty deep questions.
Okay, like what?
Well, think about it this way. If even math, which seems like it should be objective,
Yeah.
if even that can be assessed in all these different ways,
Right.
through benchmarks with different levels of redundancy, what does that tell us about measuring something like intelligence? Whether it's artificial or even human intelligence.
Wow. Yeah, that is a really profound question, and it gets at, what this whole deep dive is really all about. It's not just about the technical stuff.
Right.
It's about these bigger questions of how we define and measure intelligence.
Absolutely. And as we kind of dig deeper into those questions, I think we'll find that there are no easy answers. It's an ongoing exploration, and
Yeah.
it's something that I think is going to continue to shape the future of AI and even our understanding of our own minds.
Yeah, it makes you wonder, are we even close to figuring out how to measure intelligence?
Whether we're talking about AI or humans, I think that's a great question. And this research shows us just how slippery that concept can be. I mean, we keep talking about AI reaching human level intelligence.
Right.
But if something like math can be tested in so many different ways
Yeah.
with all this redundancy,
Mm-hmm.
what does that really tell us about, measuring something as complicated as intelligence?
So where do we even go from here? Like,
Yeah.
if even math tests for AI can be subjective,
Right.
how can we be sure we're not kidding ourselves when we evaluate these models?
I think that's where those recommendations from the paper become so important.
Right.
Minimizing redundancy, really understanding what each test is measuring
Yeah.
and how it connects with other benchmarks.
Right.
That's how we start to build a more reliable and robust way to evaluate these models.
Oh, like we should always be kind of questioning
Yeah.
our own assumptions about what we're testing
Yeah.
and how we're, understand those results.
Exactly. That critical thinking is crucial.
Yeah.
And not just for the researchers doing the work, but for anyone who's interested in AI. When you see a headline about some new model that's, made a big leap forward, don't forget to ask yourself, okay, what benchmark did they use? How did they account for redundancy? What's the real takeaway here?
So a healthy dose of skepticism is a good thing.
Absolutely. But, we shouldn't let that skepticism turn into pessimism.
Right.
The fact that we're even having these conversations, that we've got these tools to analyze and address these issues, that shows just how much progress we're making in this field.
It's like we're not just building smarter machines.
Mm-hmm.
We're getting smarter about how we understand them.
That's a great way to put it. And that journey of discovery, that's what makes this field so exciting, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I think we've given everyone a lot to think about today.
We have.
We've talked about the challenges of redundancy in MLLM benchmarks,
Mm-hmm.
what that means for AI development. And we even got into some really deep questions about the nature of intelligence itself.
It's been a great conversation, and hopefully this deep dive has, given our listeners the knowledge and the tools to navigate this complex world of AI.
That's what we're here for.
Yeah.
And remember, folks, AI is full of amazing possibilities, but it's up to us to approach it, with a balance of enthusiasm
Yes.
and a critical eye. So keep asking those tough questions, keep digging deeper. Who knows what incredible discoveries are waiting for us just around the corner.
Until next time, happy diving.